Our speaker today has been studying consciousness through the prism of psi phenomena for 53 years or so, 54. I don't mean to be dating you, but since he became a member of the Rhine Institute right after getting his Ph.D. in 1971 or 72, and I won't say how old he is. I'll just say that I'm not the oldest person in the room today. But he's still going strong at the Division of Perceptual Studies at UVA, which is a singular institution in terms of a singular department in the world in terms of its exploration. First with Ian Stevenson's years of research on reincarnation, and following with other researchers like Bruce Grayson's on near-death experiences, and Ed's in psi phenomena and the work of others that are not so well known. Ed has been the not if not the sole author, the creator of a number of incredibly scholarly works on the subject. I think the first was the one he did with his wife Emily Williams Kelly, who was the first person from DOPS who ever presented to our group back in 2005, and that one was called Irreducible Mind. Is that correct? And then he had one a few years later called that one was Beyond Physicalism, and then the most recent one, but not the last one, is one he came out with in 2021 called Consciousness Unbound: Liberating Mind from the Tyranny of Materialism. Now, this book is just under 600 pages, and it has a lot of appendices and so forth after it. I think this is the shortest one of his books so far. So it's a labor of love if you pick up one of these things and actually try to read it. But I tell you, they are well worth it. They really are. And I think you've got one you're working on now that is going to take it further. And Ed was a speaker for us back in January of 2017, 9 years ago this month, and he gave an incredible talk at that time. I'm sure it's going to be even more so today. But one thing that I've noted is that there's been a profound shift from then until now, in that in even as late as 2017, Ed and others at DOPS were still talking about basically proof of concept, talking about anecdotal instances of psi phenomena that sounded convincingly real. And now, from I have kept up with his talks on things like New Thinking Aloud with Jeffrey Mishlove and others, and now there's been a shift towards speaking about consciousness itself. So I'm going to imagine that in the first few years you were studying psi phenomena, you were not even aware you were studying consciousness as such, but consciousness now has become in the forefront of people's observation, and a question of whether consciousness is more fundamental than space and time, and even quantum phenomena itself. So, without further ado, I give you all Ed Kelly, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Tom, for that generous introduction, and thank all of you for coming out on this rather terrible day. It was a good bit worse in Charlottesville. I have to tell you, it was about 31 degrees and snowing and sleeting and all that. But that went away as I came over. And I got lost, but Tom managed to get me here more or less on time. So, yeah, I think given what Tom has said and the kind of friendly audience, I'd like to kind of give you a sense of my personal trajectory as well as how it is a reflection of a much bigger thing that I believe and Tom believes is currently happening to our civilization as a whole. if it can survive. Um, you all know the sort of basic story of the last several centuries as science became organized, took off, made a kind of methodological decision to study things that you can measure objectively, that have mass and size, things like that. And that movement rapidly gained steam, was producing all kinds of very useful stuff, say by the end of the 19th century, was nearing perfection to the point that some physicists were going around saying that, well, we understand everything now, it's just a few small things, getting our constants right to another decimal point or two, that sort of thing. Of course, that was just before the occurrence of quantum and relativity theories, which have altered everything in ways that we still don't fully understand. But the critical thing is that that ascent of science led to an associated philosophical doctrine, a picture of the world supposedly based in science. It kind of metastasized, you might say, into this philosophical doctrine known as materialism, or in its modern, more austere philosophical guise, physicalism. It comes in a variety of flavors, but it goes something like this, and we've all been saturated with this since we were kids in school. In the end, everything is determined by physical things alone. We find ourselves in a world that somehow, at bottom, is made up of some kind of tiny, insentient, self-existent stuff moving around in fields of force in accordance with mathematical laws. And everything else has to come from that. We ourselves were just gigantically complicated biological machines. Everything in mind and consciousness is manufactured by neurophysiological stuff going on in our brains. Our sense of ourselves as free agents, able to choose and do things of our own accord, that's just an illusion, a kind of byproduct of the grinding of our neural machinery. And of course, if that's the case, when we die, that's the end. Full stop, lights out. There's no possibility of any form of post-mortem survival, despite what all the world's religious traditions seem to think. Well, that's pretty grim picture of stuff, yeah. And yet, it rules the modern world. Virtually all of the advanced societies, it's the received wisdom, and particularly of the opinion elites of advanced societies. It's captured our educational institutions. Like I said, we all grew up in this world. We're taught this stuff from the time we're little kids. It still holds sway in our universities. It's everywhere. But is it true? Some of us think not, and what I want to do next is to sort of take you through the process that I've gone through, really, and what it's led us to. So, I was in graduate school. I was a good physicalist, I'm sure, as I'm sure all of my classmates were as well. It wasn't that we, had long discussions about the subject. It was just really part of the atmosphere. It's like, water to a fish. You just kind of absorbed it along the way. And everybody presumed that's just how things are. Get used to it, kind of. But late in graduate school, two things happened to me that started to shake my confidence in that picture. First one had to do with my dissertation, and I'll say a little bit about that just because it has big implications for something that's huge in society right now. I was working with a group that was doing automated content analysis, that is using computers to read text and measure things. And we had become aware that we could probably do that job a whole lot better if our computers could recognize at least the major senses of high frequency words in English. And at the time, the prevailing picture of what that was about was that each word had a certain set of meanings in advance that you could write down in a dictionary, for example. And the job of disambiguation is to decide in a given context which one of those pre-existing meanings is there. Anyway, that was the prevailing picture in linguistics and psycholinguistics, which is what I was working in. And we pursued that idea, and we got it to work fairly well. It was a big project, actually. It went on for years and years. But for me, the big discovery was that that picture of how language works is just wrong. Because what we could see, I mean, we generated this big concordance. We had a 500,000 word sample of English, all kinds of English of sorts interesting to behavioral scientists. We made a concordance, so we have all the occurrences of each word together with some context. This is an experience that very few linguists or psychologists have ever had. But what we could see clearly was that the standard picture was just wrong, that what's really going on is words have much more general meanings, which people understand, and which they can therefore, because of that understanding, they can then use those words in an unlimited variety of novel but semantically appropriate contexts, including even metaphorical contexts where words are being used in ways that superficially look wrong, but enable you to understand something new in terms of something old. Well, that was a big shock to me, I have to say. And I imagined myself going on with this sort of work, for my whole career. But I saw clearly that this was a dead end. And the corollary that I just want to alert you to, what's really at stake here is that consciousness is that with which we understand. That's what really underlies this ability of native speakers to use words in creative ways. And it is the reason, in my opinion, why the current experiment on the computational theory of the mind that we call artificial intelligence is failing. These things are not intelligent specifically because they lack what we have, which is consciousness, which is somehow tied up with biology. I'll just leave that there as a thorn in your side. We can maybe talk about it towards the end. Anyway, so this for me was a kind of career disaster. And I was kind of trying to recover from that when I got a call from my mother one day. This is in the middle of the week in the afternoon, something she would never ordinarily do. And she wanted to inform me that my sister, my only sibling, an older sister, had become a medium. And she didn't quite say it, but I understood that she was a little nervous about this. And since I was a graduate student in psychology, she would like to have my opinion as to whether it was okay. Well, I had no idea what to say, so I told her I'd look into it and report back, which I did. And in the process, I learned a lot more about William James's interest in this subject. I mean, ironically, I was working in William James Hall at Harvard at the time. There were hundreds of people in that building, of whom I think maybe half a dozen had any idea of the depth and temporal extent of James's interest in these subjects. I mean, his first and last papers were both about psychical research. That's a fact that many historians would like to ignore. He's often been described as having taken an interest in mediumship early in his career, but he found out it was all snare and delusion and gave it up. That's baloney. It's just false, as his last publication clearly shows. Anyway, I digress. Oh yeah, and in the course of looking into this mediumship business a little bit, enough to reassure my mother, I also discovered for the first time that there's this big literature of experimental parapsychology. in which people are using methods just like the stuff we were being taught to apply to various uninteresting subjects in psychology to these capacities, which shouldn't be possible if the prevailing picture is correct. I mean, this is really the key to the subject. If physicalism is true, things like psi phenomena, ESP, PK, all that, you know these terms, I'm sure, shouldn't occur. But yet, here was evidence that they do occur. I found that interesting, not horrifying or terrifying. So I started corresponding with J.B. Ryan down in Durham. He had moved out of Duke University, where he'd been for decades, developing this. I mean, Ryan was the right guy in the right place at the right time. He's a tough character. This is the heyday of behaviorism, when you weren't supposed to talk about things like consciousness at all, where lots of people, even among his own colleagues at Duke, were very hostile to the idea of these phenomena, these psi phenomena. That's the generic term for the whole lot. Receptive psi, clairvoyance, telepathy, precognition, retrocognition, psychokinesis, the output side, having effects on matter without normal motor intervention. So as a result, I ended up going to work for JB. I did a postdoc year first, but started with him in January 1972. And in about a month after I got there, I had the extreme good fortune to meet a guy who's undoubtedly one of the best subjects ever to come into a parapsychology laboratory. He, at the time, was a law student at Yale. He was directed down to us by one of my former teachers there, who had become interested in parapsychology himself, Irv Child. And well, just to give you a sense of the possibilities, this guy came into the Ryan lab one day, JB and Louisa, his wife, Louie, the brains of the organization, by the way, and all of us who were working there, sitting around a big table in the library. And one of the things sitting on that table was a device that had been built by Helmut Schmidt. He was a former Boeing physicist who had become research director of Ryan's group. He had built this thing. It was a box with 4 colored lights and 4 correspondingly colored buttons. And the subject's task is to push a button corresponding to the target, which will be picked by the machine. And it was actually picked after the button was pressed by a complicated process which involved a radioactive decay. So it was super random, super protected against any of the usual sensory leakage stuff and all that. And Helmut, it turned out, had spent a couple of years looking for people who could do this. And he'd found 2 or 3, I forget, people who could consistently do a couple of percent above or below the expected 25% hits. Well, Bill, the new guy, sitting there, what's this? Just explained to him. And as he told us the story of his life over the next hour, he'd occasionally reach out and push a button. And it quickly became clear that he was doing a lot better than 25%. I could see Helmut's eyes getting bigger across the thing. As it turned out, over the hour, he scored 180 hits in 508 trials. And when you do the math on that, it turns out you could expect a score that good or better to happen by chance once in about 10 million times. Or to put it another way, because of the way the statistics work, we might have expected to sit there for something like 10 million hours in order to observe a performance like that. And just to give you an idea of how careful Helmut was, he took his machine into his lab and unscrewed it to get inside and see whether the duplicate counters on the inside read the same as the actual counters on the outside, fearing that the subject might somehow have been able to manipulate the device. So, and it got better from there, as it turned out. And let me cut what could be a very long part of the story very short and just tell you that in my reasonably informed and carefully thought out opinion, enough evidence has now accumulated, both from case and field studies and from experimental studies, of which there are now thousands, to convince anyone who's at all open-minded and takes the trouble to study the stuff that these phenomena exist as facts of nature, and science is going to have to change in some way in order to accommodate them, period. You can take that to the bank. So now, I must say that like a lot of people who come to this stuff from the scientific side, I certainly hoped at the beginning that some little adjustment somewhere in our existing scheme might allow for the occurrence of these phenomena and sort of repair this hole that had appeared in the carefully constructed edifice of scientific knowledge. Well, I went on working for Ryan for a while. I then moved over to the electrical engineering department at Duke because I'd gotten interested in physiological studies of psi. The point being that whereas in many situations psi is just a kind of free-floating anomaly, extra hits, it's useful in various ways to find things that are correlated with success in the task. That gives you an anchor. And you can use it, for example, you could use it to gain a kind of statistical control. For example, if we could find something going on in a brain that predicts when a guy is going to be right in his ESP response, then we already have a kind of statistical control. We could do a study. We find this possible marker. Now we do another study in which we pick out in advance the trials that have that marker, with the expectation that the scoring rate will be better in those trials than in the remainder or the experiment as a whole. That's statistical control. And if it turned out that that physiological thing, whatever it is, could be produced or stabilized or enhanced in some way, we might be on the verge of experimental control, which of course is the primary goal of most scientific activity. Could also do things like tell who's the subject. A lot of psi experiments are done with unselected subjects, convenient samples of undergraduates in psychology. Well, under those conditions, the fact that one person is called the experimenter and the other the subject isn't necessarily true, and it can become very hard to tell who's really the subject. Where is it coming from? So, and again, physiology might allow us to resolve that kind of uncertainty. So those were the things that got me started on that, and we did a lot of work in that direction. We were making good progress. Like many other groups, ran out of cash. I had to abandon that. I also had a first wife and 2 children to feed. So I went, one of the few that managed to recover from working in parapsychology to work in mainstream neuroscience for another 14 or 15 years. This was mainly at UNC Chapel Hill, studying somatosensory cortex, the part of your brain that deals with touch and pain and things like that. Well, that stuff has its subtle joys, but I was constantly on the lookout for some way of getting back into my real interest, which was psychical research. It turned out that I met and ultimately married Ian Stevenson's primary helper at UVA. And before I go on, let me just mention, anybody who's interested in this kind of stuff should really be acquainted with the website of DOPS, Division of Perceptual Studies. We're a research division within the Department of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences. How's that for a grandiose title? But you can just Google DOPS UVA and you'll go right to our website, and there's all kinds of stuff there that you find interesting. Work is still going on. It's more diversified now. Ian did a lot of other things, of course, besides the rebirth studies. He had a hand in absolutely everything, all parts of the field. But we've got a good group of young folks now carrying on that work and also work on near-death experiences. And I actually, when I moved to UVA in 2003, my main goal was to create a neuroimaging lab, which we ultimately did. I've now turned that over to a guy named David Acunzo, who's better equipped to run it than I am at this point. And that's partly because my own interests have shifted over the years, as Tom indicated, and that's the part I want to tell you about now. In 1998, Emily and I were invited by Mike Murphy, the co-founder of Esalen, to participate in a new fellowship that he was organizing out there. This is out in Big Sur, California. It's on a cliff perched over the Pacific Ocean. Fantastic place. If Mike had done nothing but create that place, he'd have had a very successful life. But for him, that's just the beginning. He's in the direct line, by the way, from the founders of the Society for Psychical Research in England in 1882. In the breadth of his interests, he's an extraordinary Renaissance man kind of guy who has done a lot for the kinds of stuff we're all interested in. Anyway, Mike had become aware, Mike understood clearly that if physicalism is correct, then there can be no survival, period. And yet he also knew of a number of people working, producing evidence of various kinds, suggestive of the possibility that at least some of us continue on in some form for some unknown period of time under largely unknown circumstances. But if there's survival of any sort whatsoever, things change completely. And Mike thought, well, let's get these people together and discuss the subject. So he organized this group. There were about 20 of us to start with. And we began to present and discuss the existing evidence for postmortem survival, which consists of things like cases of the rebirth, reincarnation type, mediumship, apparitions, crisis apparitions, where a person in one place has a vision of a person who is on the verge of dying in another place. A lot of this started late 19th century, when there were wars going on in India, and the wife back in London or wherever would see her husband with a mark on a particular part of his face, which turns out to correspond to the wound that killed him when the news comes in weeks later. It's not so easy to do this kind of stuff anymore with our electronically connected world. Anyway, so there's lots of it. Yeah, and let me just say about that. There are hundreds of thousands of pages of serious scientific reports on matters related to survival. It's also true that we have people who are equally bright and well-informed on both sides of the divide between those who believe and those who don't believe that there is survival. So it's an ongoing difficulty. And let me just say that the main reason for this difficulty is the success of the research on psi. That is, in the best cases of evidence for survival, it can be extremely hard to know whether that's to be explained by survival or by some kind of psi processes involving only living persons, such as a good medium. So either horn of this dilemma, I should say, is fatal to the prevailing physicalist worldview, but it's not resolved as yet. I myself, I'm not an expert on the survival literature, but I certainly read plenty of it. And for reasons I'll mention in a moment, I myself am now, I would say, moderately convinced that survival is a reality. And I fully expect when I pass over to find myself still ongoing in some form. I'm kind of looking forward to it, to tell you the truth. Anyway, okay, so we did this. The typical format for Esalen fellowships is they meet for a week, a year out right at Esalen. But then we'd also carry on amongst ourselves in various ways in the intervening periods. So by the end of the second meeting, it had become clear that we had somewhat differing attitudes towards survival, but we're all convinced of the reality of psi and of the fact that physicalism is fatally flawed as a science-based picture of the world. And so we set out, we hatched a two-stage plan. We would first try to put together a lot of the evidence demonstrating the empirical inadequacy of physicalism. And then we would go on, and this would be the much harder part, to try and figure out what might replace it. And by replace it, let me be clear about this. Nobody's talking about throwing away science or eliminating it. We're talking about expanding it in some manner that will enable it to account for these additional things. So that's what we set out to do. And the first phase resulted in Irreducible Mind. This was 2007. And there we tried to put together a lot of the evidence showing the inadequacy of physicalism. And let me just say, by way of introduction, the philosophical situation is basically that everybody accepts that there are normally strong correlations between things going on in brains and mental things. And we know for sure that the physical side can influence the mental side. If you get hit hard enough on the head or drink too much or develop a invasive brain tumor or something, mental stuff will change. So no one can possibly doubt the possibility of physical to mental causation. But what about the other direction? Suppose I'm listening to a lecture by Steven Pinker or somebody, really arch physicalist, and I want to raise an objection. I decide to put my hand up in the air and the damn thing goes up. Look at that. Isn't that mental to physical causation? That's our normal experience, right? We decide to do something and we do it. The mental thing is what caused the physical thing to happen. Well, the physicalist retort to that is, you misunderstood the causality here, you see, because that idea or impulse that you had, that mental thing, was really just a physiological process going on in your brain. That's what caused your arm to go up. Physical causes physical, no problem. Well, under ordinary circumstances like raising an arm, that's a very hard argument to overcome. What we got to find, or to make the argument, we need to find things that cannot possibly be done by an unaided brain. And first on any such list, of course, are all the psi phenomena. That's the whole point. The generic characteristic is that there's a barrier between a person and the environment that somehow gets overridden. The barrier seems on ordinary physical principles to be sufficient to prevent those things from happening, and yet they happen. So information comes in an ESP task or goes out in a PK task. That's what attracts the hostility of critics. I mean, they feel the philosophical bite, so to speak, of these phenomena. And for a lot of scientists still, physicalism amounts to a kind of secular faith. And people who deal with psi phenomena are heretics. And, we don't get burned anymore, but, all kinds of terrible stuff can happen in your academic career and has. Let me just add that I think, that was really pronounced when I first got started, 50 plus years ago. I think the situation is improving. I really feel like the winds of change are blowing finally. And well, there's more, so let me go on. Now, lots of psychologists and biologists and so on would like to think that, okay, these psi phenomena, yeah, they're a problem, but we can just kind of quarantine that and go on with our business because we're succeeding otherwise all over the place. Well, that's really not true when you begin to look more closely. And Irreducible Mind, we revisited a number of topics that F.W.H. Myers had investigated in the course of producing his masterwork, Human Personality and its Survival of Bodily Death, published in 1903. If only he had left out that last part about survival of bodily death, this book would be much more widely recognized than it has been so far as one of the great classics of psychology. Myers was a great buddy of William James, for example, an enormously charismatic and really brilliant investigator. Emily, my wife, did her dissertation on Myers. When we first got together, one of the first things she asked me was whether I had read Myers. And I made the mistake of telling her I had, because I had read the Susie Smith abridged 1-volume edition. You can imagine what ensued. Anyway, shortly thereafter, I read the original 2-volume edition, which has all the appendices and all the evidence. So, we didn't want our book to be a book about parapsychology, experimental parapsychology. So we included that whole subject by reference and provided annotated bibliography. But it doesn't stop there. So next chapter is by Emily, and it's a study of extreme forms of psychophysical influence. And in a very Myers-like way, she starts with things that are sort of potentially within reach of the standard picture, generic sorts of placebo effects, stuff like that. But then she moves progressively through a whole series of things that become increasingly difficult to explain in physicalist terms, ending, for example, with things like stigmata, in which intensely religious Christian persons who also have vivid imaginations can produce on their own bodies simulacra of the wounds of Christ during the crucifixion. There are related things in post-traumatic stress, where, for example, an obscure paper in a psychiatry journal showed pictures of a kid who remembered being bound by rope to a bed and abused as a kid. When he thought about that experience, he would develop these rope-like markings on his wrist, which could easily be seen in photographs. And there are other phenomena of that type. And in the most extreme cases involve what are called maternal impressions, where a pregnant woman, typically in the first trimester, sees some ghastly physical accident. Somebody loses a hand, say, or something of that sort. And the child is subsequently born with a corresponding injury. Now, in this case, the influence is not on the person's own body, but the body of the developing infant. And there are at least 100 of these cases, most of them published during the 20th century and late 19th century, before it was understood how different, separate the fetus is from the mother. Originally, it was thought that there was really just one organism there. This is more complicated because it had this extra part. So there's this kind of peculiar interaction between what's the state of the science in terms of its understanding of things and what's permitted in the literature. The converse also occurs in other circumstances. Anyway, and there, just to give you an idea of the kind of richness of this stuff, there was a man named Esdale, who he was a Scottish surgeon who worked in India doing major surgeries. This is just before the advent of chemical anesthesia. He worked under hypnosis, carrying out these incredible operations. I mean, I remember reading one surgeon inserted the blade at the corner of the mouth, drew it to the ear, across to the nose, pulled back the skin. Fluid gushed out, and the patient moaned slightly. Now, there was a psychologist in the study of hypnosis who, in describing stuff like that, said, well, the patient wants to please the surgeon, and so he doesn't cry out. Yeah, come on. That's kind of stuff that we occasionally encounter in this world. Okay, so there's all of that. But that's hardly the end. We have a chapter by Alan Gould on memory. And it's too complicated to talk about here. It's probably the most complicated chapter in the book. Alan devoted a large part of his life to the study of memory and advanced a variety of both theoretical and empirical arguments against the standard picture, memory traces and all that. And a lot of the arguments that Alan advanced actually are quite similar to ones more recently advanced among philosophers of mind who are having trouble understanding how we can ever have a physicalist account of consciousness. Then we have a chapter by Adam Crabtree, who's a psychologist, historian, philosopher, on multiple personality, dissociative identity disorder. And the basic story there is that you seem to have two or more full-fledged minds or personalities associated with a single organism. And the normally hidden personalities can be remarkably different from the everyday personality. For example, they can have different allergies, different eyeglass prescriptions. They may know a lot more. They may be a lot smarter. These are the most interesting kind of cases where the hidden personality has skills that the everyday personality does not, including even things like knowing Latin. William James reported on a case of that sort. And again, these profoundly challenge the prevailing psychological neuroscientific picture of brain and mind. The idea that the brain is kind of modular, different aspects of mind are operating out of particular portions of the brain and so on. But the idea that multiple personalities could be concurrently using the same structures, it's very difficult to swallow. And in the absolute worst cases, and there are a number of these very well documented, the hidden personality may know what's going on in the mind of the everyday personality, but not vice versa. So there's this relation of inclusiveness. The hidden personality is larger in some sense and encompasses the everyday personality. Then we have a chapter, again, led by Emily, on near-death experiences, OBEs, related stuff. And here, let me just say that there's one particular portion of that literature that I think we should all pay attention to. It's the most critical part of the whole subject, and that concerns people who have profound NDEs, which are essentially mystical experiences, in my opinion, under conditions where they almost die, such as deep general anesthesia and or cardiac arrest, in which the brain conditions believed by virtually all neuroscientists to be essential for conscious experience are severely degraded or abolished altogether, and yet people are having not only experiences of some sort, but the most intense and transformative experiences of their entire lives. How do we know that? How do we know that those experiences are occurring when the brain is disabled? Because they sometimes report things that were going on during that period of time, either in the room. I mean, a patient undergoing surgery may have, eyes covered up and ears plugged or whatever, and yet they report seeing or hearing things. How they do it, nobody knows. Or those things might have happened down the hall or across town somewhere, but can be verified after the fact. And there are in excess of 100 such cases now in the literature. This shows that conscious mind can sometimes function in the absence of its normal, correspondingly functioning brain. And that removes the biggest obstacle to survival. This has had a big impact on my view of the survival issue. Again, if physicalism is true and consciousness is manufactured by physiological processes in the brain, then when the brain can't do that anymore, there should be no conscious experience, and yet there sometimes is. This demonstrates that consciousness without a functioning brain is possible. Well, we have two further chapters, one on genius, actually modeled after Myers's chapter, which is a work of genius itself in his book, and one on mystical experience. And let me just add here that this whole project, and there's more I'm about to tell you about, one of the primary deliverances for me has been the increasing realization that Western intellectual history has been severely limited, damaged, I would say, by its failure to appreciate the importance of these kinds of experiences in arriving at a correct picture of how the world really is. It's quite different from many Eastern traditions where from the beginning, they essentially centered philosophical development around these kinds of experiences. The Hindu seers of the Vedic age and all that sort of stuff. I think we're now getting back to recognizing that, and that's one of the main drivers of the changes that are occurring. Let's see. So now, in the final chapter, I attempted to assess, first of all, what we had accomplished and where we would go next. So the two big things that were accomplished, I think. Number one, we added a quite powerful, I believe, empirical dimension to the chorus of voices arising, taking the view that physicalism isn't sufficient. Most of it has been either from the physics side in a still hard to understand way, but within philosophy, and that's the other big change. So a lot of philosophers have come around now to the recognition that no, we cannot explain consciousness in physicalist terms. And by the way, Tom mentioned Christoph Koch. I've had some interactions with him myself, which were terminated when I sent him my review of integrated information theory. But he had already told me at that point that he is moving inexorably in the direction of idealism, which amounts to the philosophical opposite from physicalism. Now, so there's that part, and that chorus is getting louder, and partly because of it's not just parapsychologists anymore. It used to be like we were in a little rowboat trying to steer the Titanic away from the iceberg and not having much success. But now there are other boats in the neighborhood sort of pulling in the same direction. And one of the important ones is really a philosophy of mind, where I think the majority of younger philosophers of mind are no longer committed to physicalism. That's a big change. And even in neuroscience, I mean, Christoph Koch himself has said publicly in his, whatever it was called, Consciousness Confessions of a Romantic Realist or something, on page 119 of that book, he says, I used to believe that consciousness is manufactured by physiological processes in the brain. Just look at my previous book, The Quest for Consciousness. I no longer believe it. And then he goes on to say a bit about why. That's really a big deal. I mean, this guy's the principal heir of Francis Crick, who was the arch materialist of in neuroscience of the 20th century. Okay. The other thing that irreducible mind did was, I think, to strengthen the argument that Myers and James had made at the turn of the 20th century for a very different picture of the structure of the human psyche from what prevails in psychology and neuroscience today. That is, most such persons in the mainstream still believe consciousness is manufactured by neural stuff. So we consist of a consciousness manufactured in there by that stuff supported by whatever else the brain does. Unconscious, preconscious brain activity supporting perception and so on. Myers, James, and several others, including Henri Bergson, F.C.S. Schiller, philosophers mainly, took a different view in which there is more consciousness associated with each of us. For Myers, the everyday consciousness, which he called supraliminal consciousness, is contained within a larger consciousness associated with each of us, which he called the subliminal self, capital S, capital S. And it's, the geography here is complicated. It can be above or below, but it encompasses, anyhow, the everyday consciousness, which is produced in connection normally with ongoing brain activity. I mean, certainly brains connect us with the environment in terms of bringing in sensory information, allowing us to do things. That may be the main stuff that's going on. Myers talked about the subliminal, which he and James both clearly understood as the reservoir of capacities such as psi, mystical experiences, and high forms of creativity. He saw that region of the psyche, the B region, this is James's terminology, the B region as the source of those unusual capacities. And let me say in passing that all the same facts of correlation between mind and brain can be accounted for either way, but this picture potentially allows you to explain additional facts of the sort studied in psychical research as well. And our perspective, which doesn't have a well accepted name, some people call it a filter theory of mind-brain relation, or a transmission or permission theory. I like permission the best, with the idea that the brain can get into certain states that permit the expression of these unusual abilities. And this is something that we know how to learn more about using modern neuroimaging and experimental techniques, and will learn about, I'm sure. And so there's a kind of practical or applied dimension to the theoretical stuff I'm mainly talking about to you, which I'm sure will in coming decades find ways of making things like mystical experiences more available to a larger proportion of our population. So good for us individually and collectively, potentially, if it can be managed well. I mean, one thing we've really learned from NDEs in particular, although Stace had talked about this, Walter Stace had talked about it in the context of mystical experiences decades ago. We know from NDEs that people who have them often turn into better people as a result. They're less worldly, less egoistic in their approach to the world, more loving, less involved in making money and earning status and rewards and all this kind of stuff. So it would probably be good for us collectively if we could make such methods available to more people without almost killing them in the process. So, all right. Well, those are the big empirical deliverances of irreducible mind. Now, I mean, that was the easy part. It took us years. In fact, it took us 4 years beyond the point where we had hoped to publish it. The idea was originally to publish on the centennial of Myers's book, but it took us 4 additional years to get it done. But that was just really a gigantic clerical effort, mainly. Finding stuff buried in all parts of the biomedical literature for the past century. Now comes the hard part, which is, okay, what can we do to replace it? What might conceivably replace physicalism? So again, we milled around for a couple of years and finally settled on a first plan of attack, which led to Beyond Physicalism, reconciliation of science and spirituality was the goal of the book. And the way we approached it was within the limits imposed by the particular members of our group, what they happen to know about. We wanted to focus on a number of systems, ancient and modern, that took the psi phenomena seriously and tried to create a picture of reality that would potentially accommodate them. So we ended up in Beyond Physicalism with, I forget how many, a dozen or 14 or something, including some mystically informed religious philosophies such as Vedanta and Kashmir Shaivism in the Indian tradition, Neoplatonism, Plotinus and company. We also had some philosophers, Western philosophers, including Leibniz and Peirce and Whitehead. And we also had chapters by physicists, including Henry Stapp, who was one of the prime architects of quantum theory, S-matrix theory, his contribution. Harold Ottmanspacher, what a great name. He is, again, a quantum theorist who has been deeply involved in trying to resurrect and understand the dialogue between Wolfgang Pauli and Carl Jung, which took place in secret in the middle of the 20th century, basically. And Harold has now written a series of articles and books about this, and he sort of foreshadowed some of that in his chapter in Beyond Physicalism. And we had a chapter also from Bernard Carr, who's a cosmologist, got his PhD with Stephen Hawking at Caltech, so this is a serious guy. And he's been developing a theoretical picture based on the idea of extra dimensions. You know, we have our regular 3 plus time, now space-time. Various people, including in particular string theorists, have imagined larger scale multidimensional universes. All very difficult to understand. I know other physicists who talk about string theory as vapor physics because it's all theory and no experiment. Anyway, so those points of view are all represented in Beyond Physicalism, which had just been published before I gave my first talk 9 years ago. Wow, time passes quickly. Yeah, so in the final chapter, I tried to sort of look at the whole lot and get a sense of where is it all headed. And there really was a kind of central tendency in the direction of what's known in theological terms as panentheism, the idea that there is some highest something which underlies all of actuality as we experience, but also has something left over, much as our minds have something in addition to our bodies. So it kind of splits the difference between traditional theism and pantheism. And most, not quite all, actually the big outlier was Harold Ottmanspacher, because he resisted this central tendency. Anyway, the key points about panentheism, and in our case, it would take an evolutionary form. I think any theory is going to have to incorporate some kind of theory of evolution as part of its substance. Don't want to argue about that. This highest something, whatever it is within us as well. I mean, Myers himself had really anticipated this. And Myers, by the way, was a big student of Neoplatonism, Plotinus. He was fluent in Greek and read it in the original. But the last 2 sentences of human personality, if I can get them out, that which lies at the root of each of us lies at the root of the cosmos too. Our troubles, I'm not sure I'm quoting it correctly, our troubles are the troubles of the universe itself, and the very Godhead finds fulfillment in our upward striving souls. That is the essence of panentheism. Myers was a poet originally, rebuilt himself as an experimental scientist. All right, so that's where we left it at that point. Then, again, after milling around for a while, found a reason to produce another book, which came out in 2021, Consciousness Unbound, Liberating Mind from the Tyranny of Materialism. That subtitle was chosen as a thumb in the eye of the opposition. And in it, we first, we gave kind of state of the science summaries for areas such as near-death experiences, cases of the reincarnation type, and also precognition, which is going to figure prominently in what follows, because it's the toughest part of the whole subject philosophically, precognition, because it seems to, it's entangled with our ideas about freedom, determinism versus freedom, a future that doesn't seem to exist yet and shouldn't be able to cause anything in normally understood ways. Anyway, you see where that's going. There's a big chapter on precognition. Then we introduced no less than 5 more theoretical positions going in the same direction as the sort of central tendency from beyond physicals. Now, one was, it was sort of a historical paper by a guy named Roderick Mayne, who's a Jung scholar. And what he demonstrated clearly in that chapter is that Jung himself moved strongly in the direction of panentheism as his final philosophical position, following an NDE resulting from a heart attack late in life. It's absolutely clear in his last book that he's made this move. Harold resists this idea for some reason. Anyway, so that's that. Oh yeah, then we had a chapter on Hegel, showing that he's another member of this family, can be understood to fit in rather well. Then come 3 more scientifical empiric chapters. One is by Max Velmans, who's a big guy in the whole consciousness studies world, who for the first time came out and was willing to not only describe his theory, which has been developing over decades, but also to contemplate its extension to unusual phenomena such as psi and survival. Max ends up in a place, by the way, could be called cosmopsychism, which takes seriously the idea that the entire universe, almost hit it again, has an associated mentality of some sort. Big discussion about what sorts of mentality might be there. Then come 2 more that I think are particularly important. One is a chapter by a guy named Bernardo Kastrup. Has anybody come across him? Yeah. He's a really interesting guy, Ph.D. in computer engineering, originally worked at CERN, became interested in consciousness, partly through personal experiences, including apparently some psychedelic induced experiences. But he's got a second PhD now in philosophy and has been writing a series of books in which he argues that there is really, at bottom, only one big consciousness out of which everything else comes. Analytic idealism, he calls it, and he gives a summary in that chapter. Let me just say about that, he and I had a big argument in the course of his generating that chapter, because from his point of view, his theory entails that when we die, we get reabsorbed into the big consciousness, the dewdrop into the shining sea, and that's the only possibility. He don't want to hear anything about evidence for individual, personal postmortem survival, of which there is a lot, and I complained to him about that. And it could be accommodated within his theory, but he doesn't want to go there. Anyway, that's a flag that as a possibility for book 4, which is coming. Then really, I think in some ways the most important chapter in the whole book is by Federico Fagin. Now that name probably isn't familiar to many of you, but this guy is a giant of the microelectronics industry. he invented the silicon gate junction, designed and built several of the first microprocessors. But it turns out, along with doing all this stuff, running his businesses and so on, about 30 some odd years ago, he had a huge mystical experience during a Christmas vacation with his family, which taught him immediately that the worldview he had grown up with, based on classical physics and its contemporary extensions, quantum theory and so on, had left out something really important that he wanted to get back into our science-based picture of the world, namely consciousness. His chapter has a subtitle, Consciousness Comes First. And he's been pursuing this now for about the last 10 years or so. He published a book last year. It was called Irreducible, then with a long subtitle in which he talks a bit about his experiences and why he's going this way, and outlines his own model, which is constantly evolving. It hasn't stabilized yet, but it's very much in this general family of consciousness-driven, idealist, panentheist philosophies. So then at the end of Consciousness Unbound, we took a first stab at sort of implications of these emerging views for other things. And so there's a chapter in there by my friend David Pressey, he's a neurobiologist from Berkeley. He and I had written a chapter together for Beyond Physicalism, taking a first crack at neurobiological accompaniments of things like psi phenomena, incursions of high creativity, mystical experience, and so on. And by the way, there's a really important development in this area. Neuroimaging studies of psychedelics. This is going to be a big thing going forward. The first really important such study was done in 2012 in England, where they injected psilocybin and followed the response using two kinds of fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging. The results were shocking to everybody, including Christoph Koch, who commented on them in public. Everybody figures you have a huge experience, something must be getting really hyperactive in your brain. That turned out to be not the case at all. There were no increases anywhere, and the best correlate of the intensity of the experience, as reported by the subject, was the amount of deactivation and decoupling of a particular recently discovered neural system called the default mode network. It amounts to the kind of neurophysiological embodiment of the everyday ego. And so when that got disrupted, the big stuff happened. Now this is right in line with the Myers picture of the abeyance of the supraliminal is what permits the incursion of the subliminal. So, and a lot more has occurred since then, which is generally going in that same direction. Okay, well, Jeff Kripal, he's at Rice, mainly in religious studies. He's been a participant in our project since the beginning. And by the way, there have been about 50 people altogether, 50 some, I've never actually counted them all, but from various, academic environments have contributed to this book project at various times and in various ways. He wrote a terrific chapter on the humanities, the state of things in the humanities, arguing very effectively, I think, that the humanities have basically been destructively colonized by this physicalist picture of the world to such an extent, that a lot of universities are having trouble keeping their humanities programs going. Even in religious studies, I was amazed to learn at one point that something like half of the members of the Academy of Religion are professed physicalists whose ambition is to explain some aspect of religious experience in terms of some brain process. So anyway, Jeff argues for reversing that trend and getting the humanities back to full force. Then there's a final chapter by my co-editor, Paul Marshall, wonderful guy. He's my chosen successor in this world. trying to pass the baton to him for a book 4. He was a honors physics major as an undergraduate at Cambridge. In his last year as an undergraduate, he had a mystical experience, which altered his academic trajectory. He then got a Ph.D. in religious studies focused on mysticism. He's written several very good books on the subject. Mystical Encounters with the Natural World, Experiences and Explanations, I think was the best thing since Stace's book. You know, yeah, let me go back to mysticism for a minute. Creativity was bad enough that a former president of the American Psychological Association was bummed out by the fact that something like 0.5% of all the publications in psychology up to whatever year that was, 1950 or something, touched upon creativity, which seems like it ought to be near the center of the subject and of importance for all kinds of practical reasons. It's even worse with mystical experience. I mean, the subject has mostly been ignored by contemporary science, biologists and psychologists in particular. And to the extent it's been touched upon, it's usually with the intent of marginalizing and pathologizing it. I think it's a disgrace, really. And like I said before, I think one of the big trends emerging now is to take mystical experience seriously, as it's not a single thing. It's a complicated subject, a whole family of related experiences, but they do in some way provide windows into parts of reality that we don't normally encounter in everyday life. And, I thought I was finished at that point. I then encountered a book by a man named Timothy Eastman called Untying the Gordian Knot, long subtitle. He's basically a very interesting guy. His day job is as a space plasma physicist, but he's also a Whitehead scholar, has published several books and a mob of papers in that area as well. Anyway, Untying the Gordian Knot basically seeks to update Whitehead in relation to a lot of more recent developments in math, logic, physics, biosemiotics, and consciousness theory, with the hope, and he states this explicitly, he's got 8 chapters. The last chapter, he takes on specifically the goal of being able to explain the phenomena cataloged in Irreducible Mind. So you can imagine when I saw that, this looks interesting. Anyway, turns out he is part of a small group of theoretical physicists who think they see a way of understanding quantum theory that may also permit us to understand stuff like psi phenomena and consciousness itself. The basic idea is to follow Heisenberg, one of the founders of quantum theory, in rethinking what reality consists of. We all know about actuality, the world as we customarily experience it. But Heisenberg suggested, and these people are carrying through on this suggestion, that there's another aspect of reality, at least as big and important, potentiality, that undergirds that potentiality and actuality are constantly in communication, governed in small ways by the laws of quantum theory. And there's a woman named Ruth Kastner who is the principal developer of a new model of quantum theory. It's called the now relativistic transactional interpretation of quantum theory. She's got several books on this, including books with titles like Exploring the Quantum World, Exploring Our Unseen Reality. I can end very quickly now. This idea I'll go back one step. I told you my own view of how we have to take seriously the idea that these phenomena exist. I think the biggest obstacle to that becoming general scientific understanding is the fact that we lack a theory which can potentially explain these phenomena without falling into conflict with whatever else we know about the material world. And this move by this little group of rogue physicists potentially opens that kind of a door. So that will be the central theme of book 4, assuming we can get it published. We already have it sitting with a publisher waiting for a response. But it will announce this, describe it in some detail, and begin to work out some of the consequences. Now, let me mention one other really interesting part of this. There are related things happening right now in biology that are going to be real important over the coming decades. It is widely recognized now that the conventional approach of biologists, grounded entirely in classical physics, is failing. That there are aspects of living organisms that go beyond our capacity to deal with in classical physics terms. That's a big part of Federico's book, Irreducible. It turns out that picture was already existing before the rise of molecular biology in the 20th century, which aspired to account for everything in terms of DNA and so on. So there is a return going on to an organismic turn in theoretical biology, recognizing that organisms, that consciousness goes much further down in the tree of life than most scientists have been willing to acknowledge until quite recently. Turns out this was already alive in Germany 2 centuries ago, but it got eclipsed by the rise of molecular biology. In the extreme, it's now advocated by some, including, ironically, one guy who's been one of the most severe critics of psychical research, Charles Reber, of Reber and Alcock, if you've come across that, advocating for the idea that even single-celled organisms have some level of awareness which enables them, helps them to adapt to inherently unpredictable changes in their environments, supportive of their survival. And correlated with this, there is going to be a change in the public understanding of the theory of evolution, which will move it much closer to a Lamarckian picture where organisms have a lot to do with what happens. It's not just all random mutation of DNA and natural selection. That's happening. I mean, there's a lot of, it's kind of parallel to the situation in psycho research. There are entrenched academic defenders of the standard model as created in the 1940s, 50s, who have resisted even having scientific findings published in scientific literature, try to suppress the stuff that has challenged. All the major tenets of the theory of evolution have been undermined by more recent developments in science itself. Look up a guy named Dennis Noble. He's one of the key people, or James Shapiro, 2 major guys in that world. Did you want to ask? Oh, 1 year, sir. Oh, okay. Yeah, so that's basically it. Book 4 is still just a gleam in my eye, basically, but might happen if I can stay upright. Thank you.
All right. So if anyone.
So is it possible to explain schizophrenia by multiple personalities?
I'm sorry, would you say that again? I couldn't hear it.
Is it possible to explain schizophrenia by multiple personalities?
Oh boy, I am reluctant to try to answer that. I'm not a clinician. Enormous amount of research effort has gone into schizophrenia. I really don't know what the state of things is there. They sometimes talked about is split personality and that sort of thing. I'm not sure how close the parallels are. I can tell you that Emily and I interacted years ago with Frank Putnam, who was the main architect of the now clinically accepted syndrome of multiple personality or dissociative identity disorder, as it appears in the DSM, whatever edition currently is. And he felt it was one of the best established categories of personality disorder. So there probably is some connection there, but I hesitate to try and say anything more.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi. My name's Kim Chaffee. Okay. I have a brother who's writing a book right now on the subject of connecting quantum theory with consciousness and the latest ideas about quantum theory. And I've been reading some of his drafts, and it's quite interesting. I wonder what you think about the sort of popular books like The Tao of Physics and The Dancing Woolly Masters.
Mm-hmm.
Do you
Yeah.
have any thoughts on those?
You know, I think too many psychologists talk about quantum theory with the sort of idea that, well, consciousness is a mystery, quantum theory is a mystery, maybe the two are connected somehow. And a lot of those books I know are really pretty much scorned by my physics colleagues. So I'd rather let them speak to questions like this. Yeah, in particular, Copper's book, the first book, Henry Stapp had nothing good to say about. Yeah, so I think there is some connection there, and I mean this pathway into book 4, if it holds together, will elaborate on that.
One other is more of an observation about the connection between lower life forms like plants, for example.
Yeah.
There's a lot of new research on how forests, plants communicate often through mycorrhizal fungi, very thin threads, and even communicate. They will warn other, like trees, for example, that there's pests coming, and they'll even communicate with plants that are not of their own species or not of their own. If they're a maple tree, you know, they'll communicate with oak trees, for example, which I think is quite interesting. But one thing that I really fascinates me, and this is kind of a one-off, is are you familiar with a plant that will try to look like other plants that are nearby? Have you heard about that? This is a plant. My son is very interested in this. He's kind of like he's a kind of an amateur botanist, and there is a plant there. I think it's from South America that will actually adapt the form of other plants that are situated nearby, and it will even go so far as to mimic non-living organisms. If you make a plastic plant that looks like a plant, it will actually mimic that plastic imitation of a plant. And trying to explain that through any mechanism that I understand seems pretty hard to do.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, that's a perfect example of something unanticipated, couldn't have been predicted, and yet an appropriate response is made to it by this relatively simple creature. So, yeah, it's ironic, really. William McDougall, was a philosopher, psychologist. He was the guy who invited J.B. Rhine to Duke in the 1920s. And J.B. Rhine set up his parapsychology laboratory. He was very interested in this kind of stuff and actually had a section in his book, Body and Mind, or Mind and Body, published around 1910 or 11, summarizing a bunch of recent work in the UK, arguing for the extension of adaptive awareness at least as far as paramecia, one-celled organisms. Who, confronted with something that could not have been predicted in the environment, makes an appropriate response and retains that response for future use and so on. Yeah, so this is a growth area. And by the way, the big deal here is that historically, neuroscientists in particular have presumed that consciousness could only arise in an organism with a central nervous system. So we're well past that point now. And it suggests that consciousness is, in fact, something much more fundamental in the universe at large.
Could I ask one last question? Can you kind of boil it all down to that consciousness creates matter as opposed to matter creating consciousness?
I'm glad you asked. This, this is a big point of contention between Harold Ottmansbacher and me. He's got a book published just a couple of years ago, Dual Aspect Monism and the Deep Structure of Mind, based on his work with Jung and Pauli and all that. And he describes idealism as having the same problem that materialism has, but in the opposite direction, an inverse hard problem, so to speak, of idealism. Now, what I argued in my review of his book, and which I continue to argue, is that that way of framing the problem is not quite right, because there's a subtle but extremely important asymmetry between these two demands. From the physical side, it's challenged by the fact that we all have consciousness. We know it exists. Consciousness is a real thing, period. Matter does not enjoy quite the same status. The concept of matter, framed in classical physics, is something that we arrived at over centuries of work to explain certain regularities in our experience. What the idealist has to explain is not matter as classically conceived, but those regularities themselves. And that's exactly what people like Federico Fagin and Bernardo Castro are attempting to do. And Whitehead will probably be in the mix for book 4 as well.
Thank you.
Hey, so in the beginning of your talk, you briefly alluded to artificial intelligence.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not sure what you had planned to mention. You bookended for the last, but I work at the intersection of AI and massively distributed systems, and for whatever reason, people in that niche are prone to speculate more about artificial intelligence systems gaining sentiency or consciousness at some point, not necessarily that they have currently. I'm curious, based on your studies, the research you've done over 50 years, do you believe theoretically that a synthetic system could be conscious in the way that we assume that humans are? Or are there structural limitations because of its medium or of its mechanism that would prevent that?
Well, excellent question. Nobody really knows the answer.
Sure.
Federico and I both are strongly of the opinion that no system built along current lines will ever achieve artificial general intelligence because they necessarily lack consciousness. Could it be achieved in some different kind of artifact that has properties analogous to whatever in biology enables it to express consciousness? I'm less certain about that. But anybody who's interested in following this stuff, there's a guy named Gary Marcus that I pay a lot of attention to.
Yeah.
Who's in the same vein. He thinks it's LLMs, they're attempting to get to artificial intelligence by making them bigger and bigger, and that is failing. I think that's clearly true. They'll continue to hallucinate. In fact, to call these things hallucinations is to give them more credit than they deserve, because they, in my opinion, they don't understand anything. They're vicariously mimicking the capabilities of intelligent humans who are, speakers of the language or developers of math systems or whatever.
Would you say then that any truly generally intelligent system is intrinsically conscious or sentient? That to achieve AGI, you would need to have a system actually be sentient?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, that's really interesting.
I think of consciousness as that with which we understand. And ours is a pale shadow of the bigger intelligence, consciousness that's out there somewhere, all around us, in us. Don't know.
Cool. Thank you very much.
These systems are certainly good enough
to
do some good things and a lot of bad things.
Yeah, that is very true. Great. Great, thank you.
Is consciousness directly related to intelligence?
Well, I think so. Do you?
Well, I'm wondering how we can truly define intelligence from a conscious standpoint. And I wonder, we as physical beings, at least partly physical, are perhaps finding who we are meant to become through the physical experience of living in this dimension. And whether how we think about things are guided by the intelligence rather than the wisdom of the heart. And that's, when I think of Aboriginal people who are very advanced spiritually and compare that with the intelligence of a nuclear physicist, I'm wondering, isn't there a clue here that we've been ignoring when we look towards neural pathways as the only way for us to realize our potential?
Yeah, that's certainly fair. I mean, that's the central theme of all the great religious traditions of the world. And I think what's really going on here is that as a civilization, we kind of threw out the baby with the bathwater with the rise of science, and are just now getting to where we can potentially bring that dimension of life back into our scientific understanding of reality. That was very much Whitehead's vision. He saw the great task of modernity, Pauli also, as finding a meaningful reconciliation of science and religion or spirituality. That's the heart of what we've been doing, certainly.
Thank you.
Hello. I had a couple of questions, so I wrote them down. Can we measure consciousness outside the realm of materialism? So right now, it seems like consciousness, the focus of it is still within the brain. So like almost building the bridge between material and consciousness. But if consciousness is like energy, is there a way to measure that just independently?
Well, there certainly isn't at the moment. And
Yeah.
I mean, it's the inherent subjectivity of experience, right? We experience the world as an integrated whole of some kind from a point of view. With intentionality. We go out to the world to take it in and make sense of it. That's all beyond the scope of objective physical measurement. Now, there are things coming online. There's one in particular that interests me. It's called the Perturbational Complexity Index. It's a measurement made on using EEG methods, measuring brain waves in response to pulses, magnetically induced perturbations of brain activity. And what that so far reliably does is to distinguish between persons who are conscious and persons who are not, and to some degree how conscious they are. That's not measuring consciousness directly, but something normally connected with it. How far that will go, I don't know. But see, this is part of what I talked about before, is the kind of applied aspect of this new theoretical picture, that we can learn about conditions in the brain that permit the expression of these normally hidden, deeper, higher, whichever geography you prefer, aspects of our psyches that go beyond the brain.
Yeah, like the collective unconscious would be different than measuring the individual unconscious.
Yeah, stuff like that.
And then with precognition, do you think that a way to kind of challenge the determinist aspect of it would be the relationship between the individual consciousness and collective unconsciousness. And if they do interplay, can you then say that it doesn't have to be determinist, even if there is precognition?
Well, I really recommend that chapter by Bob Rosenberg in Consciousness Unbound, which goes into a lot of this stuff in great detail. There is a body of experimental literature suggesting that people can get information about events that haven't happened yet. The selection of targets, either forced choice, Rhine ESP cards, or more interestingly, remote viewing locations and stuff like that. These really do challenge our physicists. In particular, the Whitehead school, the whole process philosophy school, is very clear about the fact the future does not yet exist, although there are tendencies, maybe very subtle ones that we don't ordinarily think about. The collective state of the world as it is right now certainly has implications for what's going to happen. Probably lesser implications the further out you go. So there are kinds of experiments that haven't been done yet, but should be. Remote viewing targets at different distances in time from the present. Will performance deteriorate as a function of distance, like we naively think it should? But nobody quite knows how to deal with this. And they really resist evidence for precognition. In fact, I'll just mention, there's one guy in particular, David Ray Griffin, is one of the process philosophy world. Wonderful guy, wrote a bunch of really great books, one of which is specifically about psychical research and process theology, basically. And he accepts everything except precognition. And he goes to extraordinary lengths to try and explain away ostensible evidence for precognition, just because he is so rooted in this process philosophic idea about how to think about the future. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think they're probably wrong. That's going to change things.
We have somebody online, Samsung. You want to unmute yourself? I think you're on your phone. Samsung SMS731U.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Hello?
Yeah, we got you.
Okay. I have a couple of questions. One of them is there a connection between intuition, the subconscious, and the collective consciousness unified field that you can articulate, and intuitive abilities?
Well, there certainly is a connection. I can't articulate it. But, this is the basic Myers-James idea that each of us is subsumed within a much larger consciousness of some largely unknown sort that provides access to psi phenomena, genius, mystical experiences. So I think that idea actually is common to all the approaches that you mentioned. But beyond that, we really don't know very much at the present time, but we do have ways of learning more. That's one of the big takeaway things I'd like to leave you with.
Thank you. I have another question. Does DOPS ever seek to study intuitives, and what is the process if someone might be interested in participating in situations?
There's information on the website about how to contact us, and we got a sort of front end that will redirect you to whoever is best to talk with. So that's what I'd recommend there. Yeah, we're certainly interested. In fact, it's the worst part of our business, finding suitable persons to study. It's very haphazard. Sometimes they find us. Occasionally we get referred to somebody by a colleague, but it's very chancy. And let me just underscore that I think a lot of the problems of parapsychology up till now are direct results of the bad decision, in my estimation, to pursue the study of the subject mainly through work with unselected subjects, convenient samples of psychology undergraduates and that sort of thing, rather than people who really have ability. I mean, in most other areas, like, musical genius or baseball or whatever, if you want to study exceptional performance, you find exceptional performers to study who have those skills, whatever they are. But we've largely ignored that simple idea.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. I really enjoyed your talk.
Well, thank you.
Hi. Hi, my name is Lauren. I've really enjoyed your talk, and I was wondering if there's much being done at UVA on terminal lucidity, where you might have a hospice patient who cannot speak or talk at the very end before they pass. They're able to do that.
Yeah. Bruce Grayson, he's the main NDE person at DOPS and in the world, really. He's published on terminal lucidity, participated actually in a group at NIH that from a very mainstream point of view has become interested in the phenomenon, wary of the potential implications for our philosophical outlook, but willing to study it. So that's an area that might actually attract some government funding, which would be a novelty, apart from the Stargate program and all that.
Thank you.
Ed, first of all, this has been wonderful, absolutely wonderful.
Well, thank you.
This is you have successfully drawn the largest crowd we've ever had in this facility, and we don't since COVID we don't get big crowds so much anymore, but between the people in the room and the people online, we've had about 83 or 4 people attend this event today, which is kudos for you. It's really wonderful.
Well, thank you.
I've got a couple of things. One, in terms of the woman who spoke about schizophrenia.
Oh yeah.
I have had all sorts of experiences throughout my life, starting with a pretty profound precognitive experience when I was 3 years old.
Whoa.
Where I had voices in my head. I had a lot of schizophrenia in my family, including my mother, and various aunts and so forth. And I believe I could not. I believe I probably chose the family to be born into, because of the opportunities that this wiring presented in ways that didn't have to be experienced as schizophrenia.
Yeah.
And so I had a mother who was treated for schizophrenia, a dad who was a psychiatrist, who was drawn into psychiatry because of the schizophrenia in his family. And so I had the wisdom not to disclose my experiences that I was having that would have marked me as somebody who was having psychotic breaks at age 3 years old. Sort of thing.
Tom, it's amazing. You're sounding exactly like Joe McMoneagle. The premier remote viewer. For
I know Joe.
Oh, okay.
And I had a mystical experience with Joe many years ago.
Oh, okay.
But in any event, I wanted, in terms of the process philosophy with Alfred North Whitehead.
Yeah.
When I was 19 years old, in a sophomore in college, it is October of '63, I think. I was trying to daydream my way through a very boring philosophy class where Leibniz monads were being discussed, and the professor was not very dynamic. And and suddenly I was being shown a movie in my head I was trying to. It was messing up my MIDI-esque daydreams, and I was trying, because it was in fast frame, And all of a sudden, the voice that I knew as the voice of my guides came in and said, "You need to pay more attention. We're trying to show you the next 21 to 22 years of your life." And I said, "Well, why don't you slow it down so I can see it better?" And they said, "Well, we don't want to give you too much detail, you know." And so I spent the rest of the class watching this film as best I could and discerning that I was going to marry and have two kids, a girl and a boy in that order and so forth. The marriage was going to end when I was 40. And then when I turned 41, the movie ended. And I said, "Well, what happens after I turned 41? And the answer was very clear. They said, "The script for that has not been written yet."
Wow.
So
I'm jealous.
Well, you know, this is what you get if you're bored enough in school. You know, things like this can happen. But what, you know, in terms of quantum theory, it could be that by observing things in the future, which I've had a fair amount of experience with, you are, no matter how big the experience is, whether it's personal or whether it's not, when you observe it, you are in effect collapsing the wavefront and creating a pathway or enlarging a pathway for that future to actually occur. I mean, that would be a quantum theoretical explanation for it. The other thing I mentioned in the flyer, Donald Hoffman. I haven't worked with him, I take it. But
I've met him. I have his book. I haven't read it. I've talked to people about it. He used to be supported by Federico Fagin, but Federico stopped because Donald will not try to incorporate quantum theory into his approach to.
Right. Well, his position is that quantum is part of space-time, and that consciousness, space-time and matter are within consciousness rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
And so that doesn't mean that we shouldn't work with quantum theory, because we're in space-time in this dimension anyway. So anyway, well, that's all I had. But thank you very, very much. And
I'll tell you what, I'm almost out of gas here. But wait. I want to tell you one more story. It's partly responding to you. Henry Stapp, wonderful guy. It was one of the great privileges of my life to work with him in Beyond Physicalism. In the middle of that, he developed a big case of shingles. So bad that he couldn't wear a long sleeve shirt. It was all over both arms. Couldn't sleep at night without having his arms out. In the course of that, here's the situation. We were talking about Joseph of Cupertino. Does anybody know about Joseph? This is a 17th century Catholic saint. This is not an advertisement for Catholicism. This guy was seen on hundreds of occasions in broad daylight by thousands of persons, including skeptical and hostile witnesses who could not deny that the man would suddenly shriek and rise into the air, sometimes remaining there for minutes at a time. Eat your heart out, Michael Jordan. So I had posed to our group, how are you physicists going to explain this?